So today we have a talk on the topic South of the Future, Marketing Care and Speculating Life in South Asia and the Americas. And we have two presenters, Anindita Banerjee, who is an associate professor of comparative literature and at Cornell. Her focus is on science fiction and technological studies, environmental humanities, media studies, and migration studies across Russia, Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and Latin and African Americas. She is the author of the book, We Modern People, Science Fiction and the Making of Russian Modernity, and has widely published and is also a founding co-editor of the book series Studies in Modern Science Fiction at Palgrave Macmillan, apart from many other involvements, professional involvements. Debra Castillo is Emerson Hinchcliffe's professor of Hispanic Studies and professor of comparative literature at Cornell. Has been the director of the Latin American Studies program a number of times, and also was the past president of the International Interdisciplinary Latin American Studies Association. She is the author, co-author, translator, or editor of more than a dozen books and nearly 150 scholarly articles, and specializes in contemporary narrative from the Spanish-speaking world, including the United States, gender studies, and cultural theory. Welcome, Anindita and Debra, and I'll pass the microphone to you.
Thank you so much, Iftikhar. Maybe I'll just start us off. Anindita and I have decided that since this is a book that has a double title, we'll each be responsible for one half of the title. But before I go any further, I want to welcome the collaborators on the book who are here with us today. I'm looking at the list of people that have joined and participating in this session. I see Kumkum Sangari, Cheryl Vinch, Shital Kalantri. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you have an opportunity to at least jump in the conversation at some point, and there's likely to be other participants in this as well. So this is a project which, like many of the collaborative projects that Anindita and I engage on, is a project that is a conjunction of our teaching, our research, and our interdisciplinary commitments to community engagement. So this project began with exchanges in a course, then was further elaborated in a conference in which almost all of the participants in the book took part, and then found its realization in the book which just came out this year. So when we looked at this topic, we were looking at the two main key terms for us were life and caring. In terms of thinking about this, we were reminded that the Global South has become the resource for caregiving, but also the other half of this is that this kind of caregiving is increasingly mediated by technology. So I'm going to speak just very, very briefly about the first half of our title, which is Marketing Care, which sounds like a complete oxymoron. That is, how can you market something which is care? And generally, when you think about care, you don't think about it in terms of some kind of market value, but rather a kind of an ethics. We think of care as something related to the good life or how we relate to others. But then there comes the knotty question of who provides the care and what does care mean? And how does that then enter and circulate in the market? We have in our work, Anindita and I, focused on the fact that in both India and Latin America, there is a increasing reliance on women as the source of care work for the North. So we have both a gendered component and a North-South component. I'm going to give just two examples where we see the way in which what is imagined as surplus potential in the South becomes ripe for Northern extractivism. One, which Shital Kalantri talks about so eloquently, and Anindita and I both allude to as well, is commercial surrogacy, commercial assisted reproduction surrogacy. This is something that has also been a topic that another of our contributors, Shital, of course, is from law, but another of our contributors, Karen Smith-Ratabi, who is from the social sciences, has also spoken on, in thinking about the way in which in the global South, the women's bodies have been seen as a kind of repository of unused market value, of reproductive potential that can be capitalized through assisted reproduction. And of course, this has become a hugely controversial topic. It's a very moving target of legislation, as country after country has allowed and then prohibited assisted reproduction for people outside of their national borders. Nevertheless, it remains one of those really crucial topics. Another one that I'm just going to very briefly allude to, which is a very different one, is comes to us from the United States. As we all know, children have been separated from their parents and caregivers at the US-Mexico border for quite a while now, but more intensified during the Trump years. And what one of the possible repercussions of that is that these children who have been separated from their parents, at least one Fox News reporter, Laura Ingraham, has said, well, this is has a silver lining, that the United States has long had a problem of a shortage of kids to adopt, especially since Guatemala, which had previously been a country that provided many children to the adoption market in the United States, and it is a market. The Fox News commentator Laura Ingraham said, well, these children could help solve that problem. They could solve the problem of the shortage of kids to adopt in the United States. And so this is just two examples of the way in which caregiving is marketed. Again, this is not this is not a book that Anindita and I authored together. It's a project that was a collaborative project of thinking together with students in a class, in a conference, and also with the collaborators in this book, and ranges from the social sciences to the humanities and literary and cultural studies. I'll let Anindita speak next, and we'll look forward to hearing more from you and also from the participants in the book who are joining us today.
Thank you, Debbie. That was a very elegant introduction. And I want to start off actually by thanking several people in this room. The first and most important of whom are our collaborators and co-authors and colleagues in the book, but the South Asia program, which sponsored the 2016 conference with a grant from the National Resource Center, and that's what started off this particular book project for sure. And it's really an honor for us that William Phelan, who was in the South Asia program at that time, is now in the Latin American Studies program. So for us, this kind of the cyclical nature of this just shows, you know, the riches that collaboration can yield. And a lot of the conceptualization of this project, Debra has delineated, you know, the interwoven structure of all our work really, and of this book as well, that starts with a kind of an integrated view of pedagogy of engagement in different fields, work in different disciplines that are usually institutionally located in different units, and also area studies, right? And it is our pleasure really that we have colleagues here, some of our contributors in the audience, you know, are here from literary studies to law. I have not looked at the participation list very recently, but from Karen Rotavi, who was cited, from social work and policy to people more squarely located in the social sciences and science and technology studies, it is really a pleasure. And multiple generations, the 2016 conference sponsored by the South Asia program also included a number of colleagues from our partner institution in Syracuse. So it was a kind of a upstate New York collaborative structure as well. And it involved multiple generations of our students, both graduate and undergraduate. So in many ways, we started out by blurring the boundaries and spilling over many different kinds of walls. And we are really thrilled that the book is finally coming out. Publishing edited volumes, I've realized, even, you know, looking at Debbie's prodigious output is quite difficult, and it took a very, very long time between that first conference and the book that we have in hand now. But we also thank William Phelan from 2016 for choreographing a wonderful archive of interviews that were done that feature actually two participants in the conference who ultimately, for other obligations, could not contribute in writing. And that link is available in the announcement that went out to all of you from the South Asia program. So please go and look at the archives, and certain dear friends and collaborators in the audience will probably be embarrassed by their own interview featured there. So please forgive us for quality control, and we take all the blame. Having said that, I want to comment on the second half of our title, Speculating Life. And this again has a long history with the same colleague I was alluding to, who is still one of my most thrilling, along with Debbie, collaborators as we speak, Cheryl Vint, who has worked with me for a long time now. And this is squarely in her area of research. At the risk of putting Cheryl in the spotlight, I hope that she can supplement my comments at some point in our Q&A, because really it was an edited journal issue by Cheryl, the journal Paradoxa, called The Futures Industry, that got Debbie and I thinking about this topic. And that was from the previous year, 2015. So I want to thank Cheryl while I'm thanking people. And speculating and life, these are two terms that that again seem rather peculiar, just like marketing and care. But perhaps, especially in 2020, you know, I think that what was on the ballot, very much so in the recent election, that we might think about is indeed the care, the value of care, the attribution of both truth value and use value of care, right? And and the devaluation of care. But also what we have seen and what we will see, no doubt, this morning I opened the newspaper and Pfizer had announced that their vaccine trial apparently was 90% successful, and the stock market immediately went up. And so there is a, why I say this is because you might look at the term speculation and wonder what it has to do with life. And a lot of what we are talking about is one mode, which is when you look at commercial surrogacy, for instance, but medicine, right? Clinical medicine, it's financialization. It's financialization just like the pandemic on a global scale across regional, national borders, across, again, very many boundaries that seem to have been pretty inviolable. That life has for a while now been a matter of being financialized, being commodified, being traded on highly unequal terms, distributed in highly unequal terms. The right to life, the entitlement to life, has been unequal, but it has also become a matter of speculation in a very hardcore financial sense. So this is one modality in which we think about speculating life in the book. The other modality is something, again, that a lot of us may not immediately think about in how is life imagined in the future tense, right? How is the very thought of the future completely commingled with the idea of the continuation and generation of life? And this is where care work comes in, and that market comes in and merges with speculating life in how do we imagine ourselves, right, in the future or whatever comes after us, right? So the future tends to me in terms of speculation, speculative fictions, speculative imaginations, however you want to talk about it. I come into this topic as a scholar of a particular I would say array of of ways of telling stories, right? Whether it's through textual media or visual media, that is informally called science fictions. But science fictions and futurity are completely wrapped up with the conception of life itself, right? And the continuation of life and its generation. And if I may take a word from Iftikhar's initial announcements, the nurturance of life. And so this brings us, you know, kind of back into this very, very knotty problem that each one of our contributors, coming from all of their different backgrounds and knowledge, and bringing with them just radically different knowledges from different fields, contend with in the book. And it's a really marvelous collection. I think it will ring a lot of bells across a very wide audience, I'm hoping. And hopefully, you know, will give us things to teach with as we continue to work through the pandemic, right? And through all of these disturbances that are not going to go away anytime soon. And that will inevitably, as it does, but only implicitly, spill over into, you know, the other constellations of crises, right, that are distributed in highly unjust ways. For instance, the environmental crisis that we are also thinking about which does have to do with nurturance and resilience and endurance of life itself. So I'm going to stop there, and perhaps with the organizers' permission, follow Debbie's lead and invite any of our contributors in the audience to speak before we move on to an open Q&A, if that's okay.
We have, as I've just looked at the participant list, Kamkam Sangari is here. for those of you who, I won't introduce her, but I'll just say that her article in the book is on cruelty and care in literature in Pakistan and England. I also see that Cheryl Vint is here, and Cheryl talks about medicine and markets in speculative fiction. Shital Kalantri, who wrote about surrogacy and the Indian Supreme Court litigation, and Sylvia Corlett Aris, who wrote about Argentine sci-fi. I'm just checking if anybody else from our list of collaborators is here. Those are the ones I see right now, and I see that they have been granted permission by our organizer to jump in with a few words. So maybe we can invite them. I know this is hard if everybody is just waiting for the next person to speak. Cheryl, would you be willing to jump in and say something?
Sure. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for organizing this event. I hope I won't be too rambly since I didn't prepare anything, but I just would echo a lot of the things that Anindita said in her introduction. And she and I just edited a little symposium of commentary on sort of speculating life, and that that just was published in the journal Science Fiction Studies. And so I think that the crisis of this last year has really brought to the surface or into visibility for a lot more people the inequities that are already built into how life and markets come together. And so that's something that was important for us to stress in this symposium, is that, well, these things are bound up with COVID-19, and they're often symptoms of the specific pandemic we're living through, that really what they're pointing to are these deep and deeply racialized infrastructural problems around different ways that people have access to healthful living conditions that is also based on their economic position. And so we hope this will be the first of many discussions that scholars will have around these issues, because I do think that it's what gets called the bioeconomy from a market point of view is one of the most intensive sites of extractive capitalism right now, alongside the environment. And I think the embodied extraction doesn't always get as much attention as it should. So I'll stop talking now, but thank you. I think this collection really points to, like, not just my essay, of course, all the contributors and the wonderful conference we had beforehand point to the excellent work that people are doing on these topics. And I hope that it will be brought to greater visibility for more scholars now.
Shital, would you be willing to jump in?
Sure. So thank you, Debra and Anindita, and I really enjoyed being part of the conference and being part of this book collection. I think I may have mentioned this to you, but it really kind of going to the conference and as a commentator, you know, as a colleague from another discipline coming into it, I hadn't previously thought about surrogacy, but this has, you know, the kind of conference led me into a direction where it's related to my other work in sort of gender and sex selection, but it really did lead me into this direction. And where it led me was kind of to this article, which is I've noticed that, you know, in the anthropology field and other social sciences, the surrogate's perspective was sort of heard in these ethnographies, but it was absent, I realized, in the legal framework at the Supreme Court, and even in the ongoing legislative debates that have been happening in the Indian Parliament in regard to the numerous different bills that have been introduced. It seems that people are just concerned about what the output is, you know, so what do the intended parents have to gain from it? What is the role of the doctors? And the media as well frames sort of, you know, the words that come through about surrogates is, you know, renting a womb or other things that I think, other ways in which the person is made invisible and rather just commoditized. And so it was my, observation, and that's sort of the lens in which this my piece approaches it. And I very much appreciate kind of the way that you have used the word care, because I really connected to that. And in my work, I've been using the word gestational care as to what it is that surrogates are doing and providing, rather than other, I think, unfortunately, condescending and commoditizing ways in which they've been approaching it. So I very much appreciate the use of the word care, and I think we need a better term for what it is that actually is being, commercialized and bought and sold, not, a womb or a person or the child. So with that, that's again, thank you so much for letting me be part of this.
Sylvia, do you have a few words you'd like to add?
Oh, hi, thank you for inviting me to the collection. First of all, it was quite an honor and to be participating with everybody in it. What I appreciate the most about this is that it really gave me a chance to think about how literature, and particularly science fiction and emerging genres in Latin America, are thinking about the topics that have not appeared in mainstream and canonic literature in the region, and how these areas of new literatures, or particularly literatures that have to do, which I don't touch in my article, but appear in other places, like zombie literatures or steampunk literatures, and more traditional science fiction, which is the one that I work with this idea of the commodification of bodies in a way that sort of touches upon issues of poverty and issues of structural inequality in societies that for a very, very long time have really relied upon how the liberal project of the 19th century organized everyday life, the everyday dealings of the state and the law with individuals and with subjects. So I think that this was a wonderful opportunity to see sites of resistance and sites of counter discourse to things that had been so ingrained in the way people think and in the way intellectuals think, that it had been difficult to break with that particular structure. And so it had been an interesting journey to rethink about these issues from a completely different perspective, and how to think about like how biology sort of reorganizes how we think about poverty and inequality moving forward into the 21st century.
Thanks, Sylvia. The last person that I see on the list who is also a participant is Kamkam. I don't know if you would like to jump in. You're on mute. So
okay, it's very nice to see you and Anindita on the screen. I was not a part of the conference, so this is my first introduction to you both as editors, and I can't see anyone else on my screen either. But anyway, to come back to the book you've done, which is, I think, an important project, I was just wondering, instead of talking about my own work, I have been actually wondering, what COVID-19 is going to do globally to the flows of labor, which would include care and reproduction. It seems to me that, there is a rising anti-globalist trend, especially nurtured by the far right. And there are going to be enormous changes in transnational mobility. So I thought that would be a lovely, well, not lovely, but very pertinent thing to open up in today's discussion. how do we foresee this? How do we think of a future which is not as mobile as the one that has taken shape in the past 2 decades? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we invite all of you who are participating in this. If you have ideas, thoughts, questions, comments, please add them to chat. And one of us, including Come Sherry, Sylvia, Shita, will jump in and we'll continue the conversation.
So to respond to Kumkum, I'm thinking back here on a moment that also came back in this special forum that Cheryl and I just co-edited very early in the pandemic, and thinking about the contradictions that are baked into that moment. This was an editorial that went viral from the Financial Times by Arundhati Roy. And Arundhati Roy, this was, you remember, the first days of the crisis of the limbo the migrant laborers in Indian metropolitan cities were left into, where 10 million, as far as I know, or close to, were stranded in New Delhi alone. And so this was that moment, right, where everything, there were all of these ruptures that Roy started with. Curiously enough, it started with, well, something, that would come back to haunt us from India, particularly Indian media. I have not been following media from every single corner of the world, but certainly Indian metropolitan media would start off with, oh, look, there's no pollution anymore. You can actually see the sky, etc. There was a lot of this, in Roy's article. I still remember like peacocks dancing on the crosswalks of New Delhi. And then it moved into the extreme, like in this case, lethal inequality, right? That of people being left to choose between basically death and starvation. There was no choice. They're cut off from, and these were, she broke it down like these are not the lower depths yet. These are people who have a home to go back to, and yet they cannot get back home, etc. So there was a stoppage of mobility. And then it ended with this complete utopian manifesto that, okay, here, globalization has gone unpaused. This is our opportunity. And as a scholar of science fiction, I was very impressed by the headline that went viral as a meme. The pandemic is a portal. That somehow, and it ended with, we'll emerge at the other side of the portal, and we have choices, and we can emerge without pollution and without inequality. And I remember, she is a very gifted writer, but I wondered, sitting in the US, it became this kind of rhetorical disclaimer soon after, actually in global media. So all Anglophone media that I followed, it was popularized by Charles Blow in the New York Times with an op-ed with another viral headline, social distancing is a privilege, right? So this became an obligatory disclaimer, at least in Indian media. Like every piece, right? So that was your virtue signaling to say, yes, I know that the effects are unequal, but I'm going to put in this memeable line. I can't say I want to, we are not done yet, right? So what the other side of this portal is, I have no idea. So I'm not going to make pronouncements on it, but I wonder whether the time has also come, as Cheryl and I wrote, is to ponder our own embodiment as we write about these things or make, take critical positions. So unfortunately, I'm going to cop out here and say, I'm not sure yet. I mean, I don't feel that I'm in a position to predict like where this is going at this moment. Debbie, do you want to add, or please, anyone can join?
Yeah, I was seeing that Kumkum's had her microphone on, so I was hoping she was going to continue the dialogue. But
so I'll come in for a brief second. No, Anindita, I absolutely agree with you that we can't predict at this moment. But I was just actually, when I asked this question, I was also thinking of migrant labor. And I thought in a sense there was a huge involution where the problems of labor that we often, that were not so acute, suddenly became deadly. And the inequalities there became deadly. So I am just wondering what are the involutions, that are happening with COVID. At least now we can't predict the future, and I wouldn't want to because I'm a bit of a pessimist. So, what are the involutions that are happening within, let's say, national borders? And what are the changes that are now happening with transnational speculations in all kinds of labor, including care? The other thing you talked about, I think Debra talked about the, children who were now separated from parents and couldn't be reunited could become objects of internal adoption. So clearly there seems to me to be some kind of, link that is happening in many, many other contexts as well between, these kinds of layers of, global structuring and how those inequalities might be being reformulated. It's just, I suppose, one of these things that nag one at such a time.
Mm-hmm. No, you're absolutely right. And what I was actually going to offer, thank you for clarifying that. I mean, the reason why I'm so insecure is that, and I'm not citing Latour's rather klutzy attempt at providing one of those early commentaries on the pandemic here, but it does repeat the title of his pandemic commentary, that I think that like we have now spilled over the boundary from biopolitics to necropolitics. This is straight up necropolitics. We are here talking exactly as you said, that the categories that we are working with are no longer even inequality. They are the lines between life and death, right? And so in that sense, I am also being a pessimist. I'm right now not seeing any kind of redemptive horizon, which is why I went back to Arundhati Roy's article, which produced a lot of delight in US academia in March. And I was skeptical. At that time, I was, that pollution and inequality is great, but I was not a believer, just like you. But the point is that I feel that conceptually, again, which is why I kind of drew back at, it wasn't so much even prediction. I think it's a conceptual and theoretical precipice I feel that I'm on at this point, that, like, again, there has been an irrevocable, basically, push over the line into death. And we need to, kind of contend with that. And death that those of us in the knowledge economy are so far have the immunocapital from, right? And so this is for me a very kind of, as I said, a very existential thing at the moment. So I'm not being very adequate, but I would, I'm happy to cede the floor. More, eloquent interlocutors here.
Cheryl has a thought that she'd like to add.
I do, although I don't think I'm going to be an eloquent interlocutor, so I apologize for that. I just wanted to say I do think that this is a crucial question to raise, so I'm glad that it came up. And I think based on some of what we saw happen over the summer in the United States and also in Canada around migrant agricultural labor, that people were still allowed to cross borders because the labor power was needed, but there was an even greater stripping than is the norm of a sort of differentiation between how they're treated as labor power and any kind of civic status that migrant laborers might have in a nation. And so they were confined to the farms on which they were providing the labor. They had to, whoever was hiring them had to be the one to provision whatever food was being brought to them. They weren't allowed to sort of go out into the community beyond being on the housing provided on these farms. And so I think that's a concerning model that could be attractive from some capitalist points of view, to really sort of restrict the corridors of mobility for any kind of people who cross borders to labor. So they're even further segregated from the communities of the nation states in which they're providing that labor. And so I think that's the sort of pessimistic horizon that occurs to me as one of the possibilities among this. I agree with Anindita that I think the pandemic is a portal, but it's a portal not only for left-wing visions of how we might reconstitute sociality afterwards. It's equally a portal for right-wing visions. So on that very unhappy note, I will cede the floor.
Thank you, Cheryl. I, for some reason, cannot see any raised hands. So,
Well, I don't see it's not so much raised hands is because this is a webinar. We have you, I, and the 4 other collaborators in the volume are allowed to speak. Other people, please, add questions in, in the QA or chat. Come you have your mic unmuted, so that I hope that means you have a thing that you wanted to add as well.
I don't have anything to say right now, Debra, but I might come in later after hearing more people.
So we have a comment to all panelists. Do you believe the conversation of global equity is still in consideration in regards to immune capital, how some countries could outbid for PPE, etc.?
I would say yes. That has been on the table, I think, from day one. And I personally do not see yet a compelling enough counter-argument coming out of the media. But then again, I am not a specialist, so I actually do not have access to a lot of the policy and the data that accompanies it. So, but conceptually, frankly, I mean, it is the Wild West kind of situation right now in regards to your question. And it's funny because we, the cliche that got slapped on the reproductive technology industry that we write about is also the Wild West. I mean, which goes back to just show that even the metaphors that the industry, the financialization and speculation of life lives by is, the history of appropriation, dispossession, and extraction. So, but I really have not kept up with the latest in the WHO negotiations and so forth. I don't know if anybody in the audience is more informed.
Sylvia, you had a thought?
Actually, as I was listening to Cheryl, I was thinking about a little bit about the situation in Latin America and the conflicts between labor and the policies of the pandemic, and how that has played out in the country. One of the things that for me is really striking in places like Argentina, where I come from, but in other places too, is that the governments seem to be in right out chaos in order to devise some sort of policy that allows some sort of implementation of safety measures for the population to avoid getting sick, but at the same time for the economy to continue working so people can have access to their livelihoods. And in that conflict, one of the things that seem to be evolving is, one is that a lack of vocabulary, a lack of like a paradigm to address a situation like this one. And the other thing that for me is really interesting is like that people sort of willingly make sort of a bet on their own lives, and the increase or decrease likelihood of getting sick in order to continue making a living. And this is one of the main factors in why in places like Argentina, in other places in Latin America, the pandemic seems to be expanding, which is very different, for example, of what had happened here in the United States, where there's contradictions, but the issue is mostly attached to a politicization around the election and around an understanding of what's science or what is not science. So one of the issues for me has been, and in a very serious way, is like there's no understanding of, when they talk about globalization and when they talk about circulation of bodies and capital and goods of all sorts of kinds, there's very little understanding of like what those ramifications mean at the very sort of like very micro level of the everyday life of people. There's no really an understanding on how that is going to have an impact, and policies seem to be sort of not keeping up with the everyday. They're like always 2 or 3 steps behind. So I'm not quite sure it is a problem of the right or the left, quite frankly. Not even I think it's a problem of populism. I think it's a problem of there's no philosophical, no understanding on where we are right now. I don't think it really matters like where you are. I've been following a lot of the essays that have been published in the last few months. People sort of hit one tone here, one tone there, but it's difficult to really have a global sort of view of the situation. I don't think it's going to happen until 10 years from now, when we can look back and go like, okay, it might be a pessimistic view of the situation, but I think the problem is that there's no paradigm to understand chaos. That's my understanding of it. I don't know if this is helpful or not.
Ken Roberts has a question where he asks, how much of a concern is there? And I can see this coming from several different directions. How much of a concern is there about vaccine nationalism? That is the notion that the production and distribution of vaccines will be politically manipulated by national governments for their own purposes. Who wants to take a stab at that one? I almost would like to volunteer Chital, but I don't know if she'd be willing to.
I think we've outsourced quite a lot. Thank you so much to our collaborators. I was actually going to take this on through what Sylvia just said. that I think, and maybe here is where in our highly multidisciplinary constellation of collaborators, we can actually stake a place for work whose object of study is language, because I think that language is central to these problems. Because here we are, notice how you put in your question vaccine nationalism in quotation marks means that this is not a settled linguistic combination of two words yet. It's there, but we don't know. It is a speculative entity, right? A speculative linguistic entity. And to me, what has been, regardless of the facticity of the matter, the one thing that is very interesting to consider from the perspective of all of us who have some interest in speculation as a modality also of how language operates in the world, what kinds of truth values and use values that language negotiates, right? This is really quite interesting because, again, you know, back in the blissful days of portals in March, we would not actually be looking at that portal as actually a portal that can go either way, and how much the language of the right has ascended just, you know, to take the nationalism question, and along with intertwined with all of these other vocabulary of mutuality and so forth. So, you know, so that is obviously not a good answer, but what I do know is that there was a lot of vaccine nationalism, case in point, again. So I could only absorb Indian and US media at that point. There was no time for anything else, but I do remember the vaccine. Well, it wasn't vaccine, it was hydroxychloroquine. It was the quack medicine. There was this moment of, you know, the Trump Modi triumphalist brotherhood that was trumpeted in both US media and Indian media simultaneously on two channels about here, miracle cure hydroxychloroquine, which country has the most malaria patients? It's India. They have like stockpiles of hydroxychloroquine. And Indian TV triumphantly announced, we are now going to save America. So I remember that was ultra nationalist, performance oriented completely, you know. So whether or not something similar might happen with the vaccine, I think it's probably quite likely that at least some performances will occur regardless of the outcome.
Ken, we just turned your mic on. I would love to hear more from you about your take on this.
Well, thanks. I've just been curious about this, and of course, I think perhaps the perspective has changed a little bit over the last week, depending on how things evolve politically in the United States. But it's been a concern of mine, certainly, that you could envision some of these very nationalist governments, competing with each other over not just the production, but then the control over the distribution of vaccines, and then trying to use that to strengthen their own particular visions of their national interest or the self-interest of the governments themselves. And so I think for a lot of people that are in my field in political science, that are studying nationalisms and how they've expressed themselves in recent times, especially in, I suppose you might say, in sort of kind of the right-wing nationalist governments, and a lot of concern then as to how that would affect any potential medical responses to the pandemic, in particular when we finally do hopefully have some sort of vaccine to respond to it. So anyway, it's certainly been something that has come up in my field. People are aware of it, but there hasn't really been a systematic discussion of it that I'm aware of.
May I ask a follow-up question, Ken?
Yeah.
Is that what, as a political scientist, is your take on the fact that the nationalist, what I observe, of course, as a scholar of language and media forms on various platforms, that so much of it is so rooted in the performance, right? And for those of us who do language theory, you know, these speech acts and the visuals that accompany them, and the kind of baggage, for example, a moment of vaccine nationalism that I remember very well was Putin's announcement, right, that Russia has found the vaccine. I think that was the first kind of performative move of vaccine nationalism. And, you know, then there were all these memes, of course, of bare-chested Putin with a syringe on his back, but that's not the issue. I was curious that that vaccine was called Sputnik 5. So there was a whole like political history that was riding on the back of that performance. And I was wondering what government, scholars of government would think about that.
Well, there is growing attention to the performative side of political leadership, in particular in the circles where they're studying populism as a political form and the performative and stylistic component of that. So it's not something, to be honest, that has received a lot of attention in mainstream political science, but increasingly as mainstream political science is struggling to grapple with these new expressions of populism and nationalism, there is more attention being paid to the performative side of it, because that's what a lot of populist figures are doing, is performing a certain understanding of the nation and the people as part of constructing their political project. So there is a very strong performative component that is increasingly a source of discussion in my field.
Sheetal?
So just making kind of this question of vaccine nationalism, I wonder if there's some, counter narrative to that, which is really the recognition that sort of, one country may have vaccines spread throughout its in land, but it clearly won't necessarily solve the pandemic problem, given the global nature of it, and how hard it is to, stop people from entering borders. So I just wonder if that, that idea that, well, this, hopefully our new government will go back to a global vision and try to think that we, maybe it'll be first the country where the vaccine was developed and then other countries, but certainly, Pfizer has a lot to gain of mass marketing this. And the other worry is actually a place like India that is in the forefront of pharmaceutical medicine, might actually export the vaccine more than they import it, and use it to help their own people as much, or at least, again, at a later stage. So those are some of the, and then the questions of just globalization is interesting, right? I mean, right now we see the movement of goods and of capital happening, but people, and just, that was sort of the first, prior question. I wonder if, again, that changes in light of the, once the vaccine is available everywhere. I would imagine that slowly we go back to a similar place.
We have another question from Sabrina in chat. What are the expected repercussions in a reconnected, globalized world where vaccines are developed and implemented unequally across nation states? How will countries in Latin America and Southeast Asia, Sabrina says, but I assume that she would also think about South Asia, balance economic necessities like tourism, vaccinated foreigners, and the health of their own people, for example? And Sabrina ends, I am concerned.
Well, I just want to, I don't know if I have an answer to that. Just to take the Latin American part, I don't know for the rest, but for the Latin American part, since Russia announced that they did have a vaccine in trial or something, in Argentina, there had been memes and all sorts of like speculation and jokes about the fact that they were going to use Argentinian population to test the vaccine. And the general understanding in a very very sarcastic kind of way, Argentinian sense of humor tends to be on the dry side of things, was that it was useless, but they were going to try it anyhow. This beacons back to a history of pharmaceutical companies testing a variety of products in Latin American countries and in other third world countries throughout the last 70, 80 years. That's well known and well documented. I think that at this point is understood as a matter of fact kind of situation, and sort of in a very obscene way is sort of a lesser of all possible problems. I'm not sure that this is going to be realistic or not, but I don't think that I think that whatever vaccine comes about is going to be marketed and sold by whatever interests like global capital has. I don't think it has anything to do with national interest. Countries might have a say at the national level, but I don't think this is related to countries as we understand it in any way. Not simply because of countries or states themselves, but also because there's a more general interest on the rapid distribution globally of these vaccines. Then necessities that have to do with tourism for some countries might be one incentive, but there's other incentives too that are much more immediate for countries. You need populations to get back to work in factories and in schools and in universities and in everyday business. So the vaccine itself, it's sort of a big solution if it works for a number of economic problems globally. So again, I think that this is one of the situations that are going to completely be above and beyond our understanding of national boundaries. I mean, there's going to be, I think, a lot of performative situations around it, but this performative at core is a capital issue and is going to be very pragmatical. I don't think I think it's going to go in a very different direction. It's going to be like, because there's the pair or the pairing of the necessity and the urgency and the interests. This is not the pairing, but like the conjunction of all these elements. I don't know if I'm answering that question, but I think that that's where things are.
One of the things that that Sylvia mentions that I think has long been a concern, and I just wanted to underline it, is that the Global South has served as a resource for the Global North in terms of testing all kinds of medical procedures and as well as vaccines. It's one of the reasons why Anindita and I gave the book this wonderful title that Anindita came up with, and she gets all the credit for it, which is South of the Future, because the future, our northern future is presaged in what is happening in the Global South in many, many ways. But the testing of drugs, the testing of vaccines, the testing of medical procedures typically happens in the Global South, and not just in the Global South, but among the most marginalized people in the societies of the Global South. And that is something that we have long been concerned about and have been watching, whether we're talking about vaccine trials, or we're talking about the source of kidneys for organ transplants.
Debra, I wonder if I can come in here for a moment.
Please do.
Okay, no, I'm just thinking actually, trying to think hopefully. And I do see the point that's being made about, vaccine nationalism and about the interests of capital probably superseding those of many nations. But I'm just thinking that what we are also witnessing now, which comes back to the theme of your book, Debra and Anindita, is care. I think what we are seeing in the most right-wing formations in the world today are two competing things. One is a witting or unwitting culling that is happening. We governments just giving up on the pandemic, letting it take its course, and we know what that means. On the other hand, we also have a huge battle about the importance of care, which is competing with this. I think we witnessed it right here in the US in the past few months. So, and I think in that sense, though there is a sense in which there are going to be new markets in care and new markets in letting go, and both of them might be speculative, but I don't think we should underestimate the public understanding of care at this moment is probably sharper in a collective way than we have seen very often. Yeah, or I can't actually remember a time when I've seen it in this shape.
I will just say from your lips to God's ears, Kumkum, because that is indeed the last frontier of hope, that there will be like a collective kind of accounting once we come to that moment. So thank you. I'm not sure, I will ask our organizers where we are in terms of their timeline, because if I remember correctly, we were to finish at 12:30, am I right? If you could help us out, Dan.
Yes, if you could wrap up. Any final comments, either Debra or Anindita?
I am done. I will leave it to Debbie.
I did not want to have the last word. This is a very awkward position to put in. I'll just say that it's been very interesting to have this conversation with you all. Certainly, the question of care, the question of how we are continuing to speculate and market all sorts of bio-related matters is not something which has been resolved or is going away. As we all have very much on our minds the current environment, it's I think something that will continue to exercise us and will certainly be the project for future books. This one is happy to open a particular kind of conversation, which is by no means resolved in any way. I know for myself, my current projects are very much along the lines of things that we've been talking about as I've been, sitting here in Ithaca on my sabbatic instead of in India and Argentina, which are two of the places that were evoked in this conversation. One of my projects is on horror in Latin America, and the other one is on COVID. So obviously, it's the kind of thing that we're all thinking about right now. But Anindita, do you have any final things you'd like to say?
I do. I just want to say thank you so much to our collaborators, because I bet you didn't think we would drag you out and make you give speeches, but you obliged us yet again, just like you did in 2016 when we said, here, sit in front of the camera and say things to be recorded. So thank you. I know that there are people from time zones. They must be it must be really early for them. So thank you, especially from our international, to our international and West Coast participants. It was wonderful. We've never done anything like this, right, Debbie, where your contributors come to your and speak. So thank you again. I hope we can all also, little hopeful note for the future, I hope we can continue the conversation. I think just today in this dialogue, we have generated things that we need to keep pressing on, as Kumkum said. So on that note, I will say thank you again to everyone, and to the South Asia and Latin America programs, Dan and Bill and Gloria. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anindita. Thank you, Debra. And thanks to Bill, Daniel, and Gloria for support, and to all the participants for your participation and questions and comments. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you,
for the
Iftikhar.
opportunity.
Thank you all very